Okay, that's all the blue cards. Whew. Okay, now we're gonna go to the black cards. So, Arrogant Poet. 1 and a black for a creature human warlock. Whenever Arrogant Poet attacks, you may pay 2 life. If you do, it gains flying until end of turn, and it's a 2/1. Decent limited card. Mostly if you're playing like an aggro deck, you do like these type of cards where you don't mind losing a life to get the flying because you're trying to reduce the opponent's life faster than they are. That's very nice. It's a nice limited card. This is like an average a C limited card. But in Constructed, I highly doubt it because even the pain life ability on this is nice, but there's just a lot better flyers in the format. There's a lot better just aggressive creatures in the format. So, I mean, I highly doubt it. Like, the art's cool. I will say the art is cool. So, in Limited, it's going to be really good. In Constructed, I don't see it. Like, Limited, it's like a C minus, but in Constructed, it's like a D. Okay. Probably one of the best cards of this cycle, Baleful Mastery. 3 and a black for a instant, but you may pay 1 and a black rather than pay the spell's mana cost. If it was cast this way, an opponent draws a card. But what does it do? You exile a target creature or planeswalker. This card's good. This card is really, really good. 2 mana to remove by exile any problematic card, like a problematic planeswalker or a problematic creature. Just for 2 mana is absurd. Yes, you're giving your opponent drawing a card, but you don't mind giving your opponent a card draw if you remove the most problematic permanent on the battlefield for 2 mana. And if you're worried about giving your opponent a card draw, you can just wait till 4. So, this is like unconditional removal. Yes, they draw a card from it, but it's not the end of the world that they're going to draw a card from it. It's a really good card. It's going to see standard play. Oh, hey! Thank you for the follow, MTG Lexicon. Much obliged. But yeah, it's going to see standard play. I could even see some fringe application in seeing this in, like, Commander, because you do have the politics element of it, where essentially you'd be like, hey, opponent, you draw a card, okay? Okay. I'm going to remove this problematic commander. Deal, deal, deal. You don't interrupt with the spell and such. So, great card. Like, this is a plus card. It's unconditional removal. You don't mind that you're giving your opponent a card draw to remove the most problematic permanent on the battlefield and getting the tempo from removing it. So, really, really good. Next up, the... let me get to it. Sorry, it's taking a minute to load. There we go. Blackish Trudge. Brackish Trudge, I think that's how you pronounce it. Anyway, it is a fungus beast. It enters the battlefield tap. It's a 4/2. And it has a ability of 1 and a black to return this from your graveyard to your hand. Yeah. But you activate it only if you gain life this turn. In Limited, this is a perfectly fine card. A free mana 4/2 is a decent stats. It's not great stats. It's decent. But really, you're playing this because you have the recursion elements of it. And we do have in the kind of like Gagari, aka Widowbloom deck, like a bunch of life gain synergies. So being able to just, anytime you gain life, sink the mana in to return this to your hand, very nice. Though, I will say, one synergy, if you are playing this in Widowbloom, like in Standard, there is the cute aspect of this card where with stuff like with the Garrick enchantment, that when anytime you play a creature with power 4 or more, you draw a card. So you could technically use this even if you're just going to return this from your hand to be able to play it and then get the card draw. Though granted, this would have been a lot better if you were just able to return it to the battlefield tapped, but it's fine, especially if you have graveyard-based synergy shenanigans, so I'm going to give this like a optimistic C-, because it's mostly just going to be a good limited card with some fringe applications and constructed in some very fringe decks that would want the be able to return the card from their graveyard ability. Next up, Callous Blood Mage. 2 and a black for a Vampire Warlock. It has, when this enters the battlefield, choose 1. You either create a 1/1 black and green pest creature token with, when this creature dies, you gain 1 life, or you draw a card and lose a life, or exile target player's graveyard. The fact that I'm laughing at a card should probably tell you that I think the card's good. Yeah, the card's really good. I mean, granted, free mana for 2/1's not amazing, but you do get a lot of good effects on this card. Just free mana, getting like a free 2, which one of them being a 1/1 token that when it dies you drain an opponent. That's very nice. Or if you need to draw a card, you can just draw the card. And then if you need to just deal with an opponent's graveyard, because this is just like the funniest answer to like cycle decks. I'm just gonna say that right off the bat. Just being able to play this on turn 3 when your opponent like cycled a ton and be like, boom, there's your graveyard. Now I don't have to worry about a ridiculously big Zenith Flare. It's just really great. Also, the factor that you can flicker this and reanimate this, which then allows you to repeat the ETB trigger, and you get whatever choice you need at the moment. I like this card a lot. Like, I like this enough to give it like a B+. It's mostly a tech card, but it's actually a very, very nice tech card. It's good. It's a really good card. Next up, Confront the Past. Very emotional art there, I'm not gonna lie. X in a black for a sorcery lesson, and you choose 1. Return target planeswalker card with mana value X or less from your graveyard to the battlefield, or you remove twice X loyalty counters from target planeswalker and opponent controls. Oi, this is a really good card. Okay, here's the reason why this card's really good. The factor is, it's a lesson, so you can tutor this out of your sideboard. And the thing is, mostly with Planeswalker removal or reanimation spells, you only really want to play it in a Super Friends type deck, main board if you are playing like a Super Friends list. But the best part about this card is you don't have to be like a Super Friends list per se. Like, let's say you're playing this like in a mid-range Mardu deck where you have like a few Planeswalkers, but you don't really need to reanimate them unless you need to reanimate them at certain times. And you do throw a few like learn cards in there that are good. You could just tutor this out of your sideboard whenever you need to, when you're at the circumstances where either A, you have a planeswalker that you would not mind to return back to the battlefield. This is returning to the battlefield, which that's why it makes this card really powerful. And just have the mana sink return a very powerful planeswalker to the battlefield. Very nice. Or let's say your opponent has a planeswalker you want to remove. Just learn, get Confront the Past, and then just essentially spend the X you need to remove that planeswalker like that. This is a very good card. Like, it's really good sideboard card, but in Super Friends list, they're probably going to mainboard this. I could definitely see this in EDH and Atraxa Super Friends lists, so yeah, this is like a B+ card. This card is like, yeah, it's a situational card, but the factor is this is a very powerful situational card that you can tutor out with learn effects, so yeah, card's good. Card is just really, really good. Next up, Crushing Disappointment. Ugh. Like I said, I don't like the abusive teacher archetype that they're doing here, and ugh. Okay, 3 and a black for a instant. Each player loses 2 life, you draw 2 cards. Overall, it's a good card, unfortunately. The thing is, if you're playing like a Mardu control list, or you're playing like any list where you're primary black and you're playing a control deck, 3 mana instant, draw 2 cards, and then drain your opponent. That's actually pretty nice. It's a pretty powerful effect. I just don't like the flavor or the story implications here. That just kind of bugs me, if I'm being quite frankly honest. But it's still 4 mana instant speed, draw 2 cards, and drain your opponent. Or maybe even finish off your opponent. Though, keep in mind, this is a card that if you're at 2 life, that you will accidentally lose the game if you do it. So, be cautious. But, 4 mana to draw 2 cards. Always decent in the right deck archetypes. Yes, there are better draw cards in the format, but if you're playing like a Mardu where you're splashing the black and you can't play any of the powerful like 2 of the free black spells essentially that are card draw, this is a perfectly fine option. And it gets a lot better in EDH when you consider that then you make multiple life loss essentially. Didn't want to miss that component. Anyway, next card, Essence Infusion. 1 and a black for a sorcery. Oh, wait a minute. Brain fart. This is what happens when you get late on these. You kind of have brain farts. As for Crushing Disappointment, it's a C. It's an average C card. Essence Infusion. 1 and a black for a sorcery. Put 2 +1/+1 counters on target creature. It gains lifelink until in a turn. So 2 mana, buff up a creature, give it temporary lifelink at sorcery speed. The sorcery speed hurts this card a lot. That being said, still, a 2 mana make your 1-drop into theoretically a free. That's not bad. That's actually pretty good in limited. And in constructed, if you have counter-based synergies, it's a nice consideration, though I do think there are better counter cards, so I think it's going to be C in fringe budget play and counter-based deck designs. But in limited, it's decent, so it's enough that I would give it like a D+. Like, it's a perfectly fine way to buff up your creatures, but sorcery speed hurts the card a lot. Next up, the Eye Twitch. It is an eye bat. That is the creature type. It has a 1/1 with flying, and whenever it dies, you learn. Pretty good card. A 1/1 flyer that then, when it dies, you learn. That's pretty good. Especially if you have like sacrifice-based synergies and such, so you could sack the bat to learn when you need to. That's very nice. So, perfectly fine card. If you're playing learn spells, you probably will play some Eye Twitches. That is still a weird name for this card. Anyway, for Eye Twitch, I will give it like a solid C. Like, I like my learn spells for cheap, and this one's pretty cheap. And there are deck designs where you have ways to pretty much aristocratic this to get the spell in the stack. Like, we have Witch's Oven and stuff like that in the format. So, and it's still a 1 mana 1/1 flyer, which that is still pretty aggressive and limited and such. So, keep an eye. It's a pretty average C. Next up, Thalunk. 1 and a black for an instant. Target creature gets -X until end of turn, where X is 7 minus the number of cards in that creature's controller's hand. This one is good and bad at the same time. It's good in some matchups, it's bad in some matchups. Like, let's say for example, you're playing against a control deck. They have like a powerful creature and such, and they like to keep an average of 3 to 4 cards in hand. Theoretically, you cast this, their creature gets a -3, or -4. Maybe it's an indestructible creature, which then will still automatically die since it's stat reduction, not the destroy target creature. That's very, very nice. I could even see this going against aggro decks, because it's a way to answer Season Hallowblade, since a majority of Season Hallowblade decks do try to at least keep a few cards in hand, though the catch-22 with that is they could just discard their hand entirely. I don't know if they would ever do that, but they could, and then not get stat reduction from it. So, it's a weird card. It's like on average a C- card, because it's a good conditional removal, but it's against some certain archetypes and some certain indestructible creatures, and the problem is those indestructible creatures have ways to answer it where they cannot die to the spell. Now, granted, you're going to give your opponent seriously disadvantaged by potentially making them discard their entire hand if they really want to keep their Season Hallowblade. But, on the other hand, they might just let it die, and then later down the line, when you try to do it again, they have 2 lands, and they're like, sure, I'll just discard my 2 lands and still keep my Season Hallowblade, so. I don't think the card's bad, but I do think it's one of those cards that is very restricted to what meta you playing it in, and it's more of a sideboard removal card. Especially since we're getting some really good removal card in the set. Like, seeing that this is one of the not greatest removal should tell you how good removal we're getting in the format. Like, we're going to be talking about one in a bit. Like, Go Blank is 2 and a black for a sorcery. Target player, you could target yourself if you need to. Target player discards 2 cards, which then makes it like, oh, we can use this for reanimation, except for the fact that then you exile all cards from that player's graveyard. Oh. Okay. Now for this one, this is more good in the sense that it's a hand disruption spell that's graveyard hate. It's nice that we're getting more graveyard hate to help us against the cycling decks in the format. So, or even helps us if reanimation decks become very popular enough. This is a great tech card. You can even mainboard it if you're playing this in like a Turgid deck, because keep in mind, you still get the quote-unquote... I do... No, I think it's not that great in Turgid decks even, because the problem is... I can't remember if the effect of Turgid goes off before it does its exile effect. If it doesn't go off before it exiles, then the card will be really good in Turgid, but if the exile effect does go off before Turgid can target the spell... It's not bad. Like, it's a pretty good card, plus the art on it is amazing. So, you're going to play this in the decks, you want the graveyard hate, and you want the hand disruption, so keep an eye on it. It's definitely one of the better Mind Rots we got. So, oh yeah. And in grade, honestly, it's just a C. It's a C that can go up depending on if you're in a format where graveyard hate is necessary. Next up, Hunt for the Specimens. 1 and a black for sorcery. Create a 1/1 black and green pest creature token with, when this creature dies, you gain 1 life, and you learn. So yet again, like I said, 2 mana for learn. I'm a little bit cautious on it, but the way I'm looking at this is a 2 mana 1/1 that essentially allows you to learn as an ETB trigger. That's the way I'm looking at it, though granted, it doesn't have ETB trigger synergy, yada yada yada. Of course, I know that. But still, a 2 mana, get a token, and then learn. That's pretty nice. It is still cheap, so you can use this to... Like, let's say, for example, you can tutor this to tutor the spell, like, that allows you, as an alternate cost, you have to exile a creature to remove something, for example. You could turn 2 do this, turn 3, get that specific removal spell, and then just exile the token and such you generate from this. That's a very nice 1-2 punch kind of scenario. So with that, I'm very optimistic on this card as a good budget option. And maybe even see some really good constructed play. So, I'm going to be optimistic and give this like a C+. This card is actually a lot more decent than you think at first glance. Next up, Lash of Malice. 1 mana black, essentially instant. Target creature gets +2, -2 on 2 on a turn. Now, here's a removal to help us against the Season Howlblades of the world. 1 mana to give a creature -2 toughness is very, very nice in this format, especially with a lot of powerful 1 and 2 drops that we have. Yes, it doesn't kill Bone Crusher, it doesn't kill Lovestruck Beast, but it kills the Innkeepers, it kills the tokens. And the factor is, you can later down the line, if you have a creature of the mid-range value and just use this as a combat trick to help buff your creature for a finisher, that is very, very nice. Plus, it's also a cheap instant spell, which could trigger Magecraft. That's also another component you gotta keep in mind, so... This one is very optimistic. Like, if it weren't for the fact that we got so much good removal... This one I'm still gonna say it's like a B+. It's a really good removal spell for 1 mana. But there is definitely a lot of A+ removal we're gonna be talking about. So the factor that this is a B+ should tell you how good is the removal we're gonna be seeing in about a minute. Or 30 or an hour, but you get what I'm saying. Leech Fanatic. It is a 2 mana, 2/2 human warlock. As long as your turn, it has lifelink. Honestly, this is like a C. It's a pretty average C card. You play it in Limited as a bear with upside. In Constructed, if you need a lifelink, there are better lifelink creatures in the format. But it is a nice creature to have. It's hard because you can't really play this in a Cleric's list that does have life gain synergies. Or even in the Angels list to have life gain synergies, because the problem is it's a human warlock, so But it's still a bear with upside. You can still play this as a budget option if you're playing a lifelink deck of sorts, so keep an eye on it. But it's an average card, so with that, it just gets a C. Next up, the Mage Hunter. 3 and a black for a creature horror that's a 3/4. It has, whenever an opponent casts or copies an instant or sorcery spell, aka Magecraft, that they lose 1 life. Okay. I'll say this. For Limited, this is going to be a pretty decent card, especially since Magecraft is going to be a thing that is something to keep in mind. Because the factor is, it does hose Magecraft strategies. Though stated before, in Limited, on average, people are going to have about 5 to 8 instant sorcery spells. So this one's just going to drain, like, about, potentially, if we're saying, I'm going to say optimistic, 3. So being able to still have this as a 4-mana drain-free life, that's pretty nice. In Standard, though, this is also going to be a really nice card in some decks, that especially if a Magecraft Storm deck exists. Because pretty much then, anytime they try to cast their instant sorcery spells for the Storm count, you then drain them, and then they have to be very cautious. I don't know if it's going to see play in Historic, since there are better cards that does this effect. Like, if you're trying to counter Storm in Historic, we have Dampening Spirit to do that, so I think Mage Hunter's not going to see much extended play beyond that. But I think in Limited and in Standard, it's pretty decent tech option against Magecraft shenanigans. So I'm going to be optimistic and give it like a C. Like, there are definitely better tech options, but this one is a pretty decent one, especially if you're a aggro deck of sorts. Next up, Mage Hunter's Onslaught. 4 mana for a sorcery. Destroy target creature or planeswalker. Whenever a creature blocks this turn, its control loses 1 life. Okay, sorcery speed hurts the card a lot, but still, in Limited, this is 4 mana unconditional removal, which then essentially, you then have the aggressive edge to it that once you attack in with your stuff, if your opponent tries to block, they're going to get drained. So it's pretty nice for Limited. Like, in Limited, it's going to be a very good card. And in budget, in aggro-based decks, I can see it in budget aggro decks because, yet again, it does have a very aggressive edge toward it by making the opponent lose life if they even try to do, like, wise blocks and such. Which, in aggro decks, you're trying to get as much incremental many points of damage as you can. So, as a budget option in Standard, I could definitely see it as well. It's still on average a C. Like, there's better removal in the format, but it is still a decent removal spell for Limited, and some decent aggro decks in Constructed. Next up, Necrotic Fumes. Free mana, 1 and 2 black for a sorcery lesson. It has, as an additional cost to cast a spell, exile a creature you control. When you do, you exile target creature or planeswalker. And it's a lesson. Now, remember what I said before? There's that 2-cost learn spell that then gives you a token to generate to help you essentially be able to cast this. This is the spell I was referring to. So this is essentially a tunable, unconditional exile removal, and you don't really have to worry about what you exile. You can just exile a token. Pretty good. This is a pretty good unconditional removal spell that you can tutor out of your sideboard. That's really good. That is really good. We played stuff like Hero's Downfall in the past. Yes, Hero's Downfall technically was at instant speed. This is sorcery, so that is a definitely significant cost to the card. But the fact that you can tutor this out of your sideboard is very powerful, and the fact that we have learning spells in black that allows us to generate the body presence to cast a spell, really nice. I'm going to give this an optimistic B+. This is actually a pretty good card to tutor out of the sideboard. Next up, Novice Dissector. 3 and a black for a Troll Warlock. It has 1, is activated 1, and sacrifice another creature. You can't sacrifice itself. Put a +1/+1 counter on target creature. That's pretty good. Activate only as a sorcery, and it's a 3/3. This is one of those cards where it's going to be a decent limited card, because the factor is if you're playing sacrifice-based synergy type deck design in Limited, this is a nice mana sink one that allows you to buff your creatures up. That's very nice. You can even use this as a semi... Well, no, you can't even use this as a combat trick because you only can activate the ability as a sorcery speed activation. So it doesn't even got that going for it. So I think you're only going to be playing this in Limited. Maybe some budget Standard, but I highly doubt it. There's just better cards in the format. So I'm going to give it like a D-. Like, it's not an F card because it still has some nice applications in Limited, but it's not amazing. I'm just going to say that right off the bat. Art though is pretty cool. Next up, the Auric Lore Mage. 4 mana for a human warlock, and it's a 3/3. And it has tap, search your library for a card. Put it into your graveyard, then shuffle. If it's an instant sorcery card, you then put a +1/+1 counter on Auric Lore Mage. Okay, so Entomb potentially adds pretty much giving us a activated ability that is more or less a quote unquote once this untaps and can be able to tap a instant speed Entomb effect. That's pretty good in the right decks. Like in reanimating based deck strategies, they are going to like this. Like, let's say for example, you can just use this. Like, let's say you have like the new Luca out on the battlefield, and you have Orlick Lore Mage out. You then can just tap this, tutor for like a Vorinclad, or tutor for the biggest thing that could finish off a game, and then just use Luca to just give it haste and just win the game. Like, never underestimate Entomb effects, and the factor that this is one on a creature is really, really nice. So it's something to keep an eye out. And the factor is it can buff itself if you decide to put a instant sorcery card in the graveyard, which since we have flashback in like historic formats, that's something to at least keep in mind. Or even escape spells. This is actually going to be very nice with escape instant sorcery spells, because then you can just cast it for its escape cost in the graveyard. That's actually really cool. So, keep an eye on this. I'm going to give it a B-. This card is good. It's going to be really only good in reanimated decks or decks that can take advantage of the card being in the graveyard, but don't underestimate it. I'm just going to say that right off the bat. Don't underestimate it. Entomb has always been a very powerful ability. Next up, we got the Pestilent Cauldron as well as the Restorative Burst. So, Pestilent Cauldron, what does this do? It's a artifact for 2 and a black. It has discard a card, create a 1/1 black and green pest creature token with whenever this creature dies, you gain 1 life. So, pretty much discard a card, create a token. That's always really good. Then it has tap it for 1 and tap it. Each opponent mills X cards, where X is the amount of life you gain this turn. That's pretty interesting. And then has 4 and activated to exile 4 target cards from a graveyard. Note, it says from a graveyard. It does not have to be from your own graveyard. Like, it could be from an opponent's graveyard, or it could be from your graveyard. And if you do, you draw a card. Okay, this front portion artifact is pretty good. Now, the catch-22 is, it is an artifact. There's a lot of good artifact hate in the format in general at the moment. But this is a pretty good, decent mana sink artifact for both, like, I would say, for EDH as well as for limited and such, because being able to discard a land you just don't need and such and just get a token out of it, that's very nice. And then being able to force your opponent to mill cards if you're going to gain a lot of life somehow, like through a big life leak creature or such. Never underestimate artifacts that can make you mill your opponent in limited. Those are usually really, really, really good. So don't underestimate that second activated ability. And then 4 mana, I love this activated ability. Just to exile 4 target cards from a graveyard to draw a card. That's good to help us counter against escape cards in the format. That could also help us with rogues, because then we could just exile our own cards if we have this on the battlefield to make our graveyard smaller, which then makes their journey into the story cost a lot more, and their Drown in the Locks less effective. So I like the card. Now, granted, the way I think you have to look at this card is that it's technically just going to be a free mana. You play this artifact, and you're going to automatically try to activate the discard ability so you can get a token out of it. Because a free mana, get this artifact to get a pest token, pretty good. Now, I like the front portion a lot. I love the back portion. Restorative Burst, 3 and 2 green for a sorcery. Return up to 2 target creature, land, and or planeswalker cards from your graveyard to your hand. Each player gains 4 life. Whoop-de-whoop-de-doo. Then you have to exile the spell. Okay, for those who don't know, I really like regrowth spells. Essentially, one of my favorite spells was essentially Balagad, the Balagad Retreat from Syndicar's Rising. That was one of my favorite cards from Syndicate Risings. I always love a good regrowth effect. It's very good in like combo / also just fun janky decks or even control decks. Just be able to return cards you need from the graveyard to your hand. And just being able to return a creature, a land, or a planeswalker, very nice. Like, you could return a Fable Passage, play the Fable Passage and such, and be able to just filter out. You could just return, like, 2 powerful creatures that you don't mind playing next turn. And then just being able to like return maybe a powerful planeswalker that you're going to play next turn. Very nice. And then gaining 4 life. If you're playing this in the deck that you're probably going to be playing this in, you don't mind your opponent gaining the 4 life because you're trying to get more value to inevitably win the game later down the line. Plus, it could also help against aggro because the life gain will help against aggro matchups. So, I love the back portion of this card. And the fact that I like the front portion, I'm going to be optimistic and just give this an A. Like, this is a solid A card. The problem is there's going to be really good removal in the format to remove monocolored permanents. We're going to get to that in a minute. Well, not in a minute, once we start getting to the golden cards, but I still like this card a lot. Even if this is the front portion is just free mana, have this artifact that your opponent has to remove shortly, but even if they do, you just discard a card and get a pest token out of it. Very nice. I like this card a lot. Okay, let's get to a doozy of a card. Plum the Forbidden. 1 and a black for a instant. It has, as an additional cost to cast a spell, you may sacrifice 1 or more creatures. When you do, you copy this spell for each creature sacrificed this way. And what does the spell do? You simply draw a card and lose a life. Okay, this is probably the best spell in the format that's coming to help activate Magecraft. That's in Standard. Because the thing is, most of the Magecraft decks that I think are going to be popular are the ones that are going to have cheap Magecraft creatures and such, and maybe have some realm of token generation and such. So if you can put this in a deck where you generate a lot of tokens like your Go Wide deck, and you have like one specifically, you could just, I don't know, just sacrifice free creatures, copy the spell 3 times, and do free powerful free Magecraft triggers. Like, let's say you're playing Sultai, for example. Maybe you're playing like a Sultai deck where you're playing that broken Simic Mythic we were talking about, where anytime you Magecraft, you reveal the top card and you draw, and you essentially reveal the card. If it's a non-land, you pay the 1 mana. Imagine being able to activate that 3 times. Like, the factor is we now have to look at every Magecraft spell or every spell that has a semi-storm trigger, in a sense, because this spell exists. Now, and the catch-22 is, I'm still talking about the factor that you can just use this for Magecraft. The factor is, this is just essentially just card draw that can be scaled from just drawing 1 card, which is fine for 2 mana, to like drawing 2, 3, 4, 5, and then maybe having death triggers if you're playing this in the right deck design. That is really, really good. Like, I think this card is, it's balanced, but it feels like a busted card. It's a balanced card, but it feels busted. So I'm giving this like an A-. This card's pretty good. It's definitely going to be the card that if Magecraft is going to be a thing, I think the list that are going to be playing Plum the Forbidden are be the ones that'll be going to try to give this card a shot. Or give the mechanic, like, deck archetype a shot, essentially. Next up, the Poet's Quill. Hey, we can finally equip our creatures with pens. The pen is mightier than the sword, anyways. Anyway, it's just a 2-mana artifact equipment. When it enters the battlefield, you learn. And it has a equipped creature gets +1/+1 and has lifelink. Honestly, as stated before, it's always nice to have cheap learn spells, and this is a pretty decent cheap learn spell. The factor is you get the semi-card draw, you tutor for something you need, or you can rummage if you need to, and the factor then you can equip this to a creature. Yes, the equip cost is a little bit costly, but you do get a pretty decent effect, being able to get a +1/+1 boost and lifelink. That's very nice, especially in, if we hint, wink, wink, nod, nod, with Widowbloom having a lot of life gain synergies. That's something to keep in mind. Also in Orzhov life gain decks, that's something to keep in mind as well. If you want to have an option to be able to tutor for a lesson card, here you go. So, yeah, this is like a B-. This is a pretty decent learn card that has a pretty decent equipment attached to it. So, keep an eye on it. Next up, the card that started all the shenanigans of talking about the ways you can storm off with Magecraft. Professor Onyx, aka Liliana, but Professor Onyx for now. Legendary Planeswalker Liliana. It has Magecraft. Whenever you cast or copy in an instant or sorcery spell, each opponent loses 2 life and you gain 2 life. But we'll talk about that in a minute, but let's talk about the rest of the card. It has +1, it has 5 loyalty, it has +1. You lose 1 life, look at the top 3 cards of your library, put one of them into your hand, and the rest into your graveyard. So strategic planning as an activated ability, cool. -3, each opponent sacrifices a creature with the greatest power among creatures that player controls. Okay, that's cool. And then -8, each opponent may discard a card. If they don't, they lose 3 life. Repeat this process 6 more times. Okay, what's my opinion on Professor Onyx, aka Liliana? It's a good card. It's a pretty good, late game Planeswalker card. First, let's talk about the Magecraft ability. Yes, the Magecraft ability is pretty silly, being able to drain your opponent and gain life. Very nice, especially if we have quote-unquote ways to cast multiple spells and be able to drain multiple life. Hint, hint, wink, wink, nod, nod. So yeah, I could definitely see Professor Onyx in a deck like that, where maybe you generate a lot of tokens and such, and then you play Professor Onyx, and then you play that Plum the Forbidden. Oh, you get a bunch of card draw, and yeah, you're going to lose life, but hey, you're going to gain that life back and drain your opponent in the process. So even if you're doing this incrementally, it's also pretty decent. So overall, that effect on it, very powerful. Now, the +1, very nice. It gives you semi-card draw. You're putting cards in the graveyard, so if you're putting this in the right deck archetype where you're interacting with your graveyard, that's actually pretty nice. The only catch is we do have mill in the format, so maybe milling cards in your graveyard is not the best thing in the world. Maybe. But still, it is give you card selection, and card selection on a Planeswalker you never take for granted. -3 is also really nice, being able to remove the most highest power creature that each opponent has, so you can play this in Commander and such. It's very nice to have this type of effect. You should never underestimate it. We play Soulshare in the format for a reason. It is sorcery speed, though, but still, that's really nice. And then -8, if you can get to the ultimate, which, by the way, with Vorinclex in the format, you can ultimate this as soon as it gets on the battlefield. Wink, wink, nod, nod. If you can get to the ultimate, that is a pretty back-breaking ultimate. Yes, it's not going to be back-breaking if you're going against a control deck where your opponent has 7 cards in hand, and then they're like, okay, sure, I'm going to discard my entire hand. I'm not going to lose. Or, better yet, I'm just going to discard cards that I don't mind discarding and just lose 3 life on the cards that I want to keep in my hand. There's going to be some circumstances where it's not going to be as back-breaking, but there's going to be some circumstances where you have a pretty good chance of winning the game when you do that ultimate, because you're making your opponent lose a lot of resource or a lot of life, and then you could just use that to your advantage, whether to swing in for lethal, or just make your opponent add a significant loss of resources where, let's say, for example, that resources can become a gain if you have stuff like Turgid on the battlefield and such, and you play Turgid. Let's say you have Vorinclex and Turgid on the battlefield. You then play Professor Onyx, automatically ultimate. Then you're giving your opponent a bit of a rock and a hard place, because then they have to decide whether or not they want to give you stuff to essentially, from what they're discarding, to affect Turgid and such. So I could definitely see a Gagaria value deck essentially playing this and such and giving this a shot. So yeah, this is pretty much your typical A card. It's a good, pretty much late game Planeswalker. There's a lot of synergies within Standard at the moment. Plus, also, it has some silly shenanigans within Commander, especially with Magecraft, since we have ways to infinitely copy spells. Thank you, Chain of Smog, for existing as a card. So yeah, pretty silly card, and also pretty silly for Oathbreaker. It's going to be a pretty silly Oathbreaker card. Next up, the Professor's Warning. 1 mana for an instant. Put a +1/+1 counter on target creature. Okay. But you only can choose one, or you can just give target creature indestructible until end of turn. That's what we call a pretty decent combat trick. Okay, just 1 mana at common to either buff your creature up temporarily as a combat trick, so maybe it can survive combat, or just essentially giving it indestructible, so making it still survive combat and maybe trade into with a creature to make the creature die. That's very, very, very nice. That's a very nice spell. This is a very nice common. It's going to be a nice cheap combat trick for limited, but it's also going to be a very decent constructed card in the decks that want this type of effect. It's also a cheap spell that can protect your Magecraft creatures while also get a Magecraft trigger off it. Pretty good. I'm going to give it like a... It's like a C+. It's a pretty decent combat trick. Never underestimate a combat trick for 1 mana that protects your creatures. Or protects your creature, I guess. Singular, but you get what I mean. Next up, Promising Dust Mage. 2 and a black for a creature human warlock. It has, when this dies, if it had a +1/+1 counter on it, draw a card. This is mostly for limited. It's limited, it's going to be pretty decent because there are ways to put counters on this creature. You can make it bigger, and then if the creature dies, you then can draw a card. That's very nice. In Constructed, I mean, Great Hinge is a card, but you're mostly going to get your card draw engine from Great Hinge anyway. There are ways to put counters on this, but I think there are better free drops in the format, so it's like a C- card. It's on average going to be a decent card filler in Limited, but I don't think you're going to be playing this much in Constructed. Next up, the Sedge Witch. Oh, I want to talk about this card. 3 mana for a free 2 with Menace. Ward, pay for your life. So, if your opponent tries to remove this, they have to pay for your life for the spell to resolve. Or ability to resolve to remove it. And it has Magecraft. Whenever you cast or copy an instant or sorcery spell, create a 1/1 black or green pest creature token with yada yada yada, the pest creature stats. Okay, so this is a young Pyromancer for free mana. Okay, yes, free mana for young Pyromancer is very, very expensive. Don't get me wrong. But I do think this card is pretty nutty. Because like I stated before, in black, there's going to be a lot of ways that we can copy our spells. AKA, point back to Plumb the Forbidden. Like, let's say you already are growing up your board presence and such. You build, like, you get some early game tokens. You play this on turn 3. You maybe hold up a protection spell and such. Maybe play it on turn 4 to protect it. You didn't protect it, which then when you protect it, then you essentially then generate a token. And then later down the line, you can just play Plumb the Forbidden, sack all the tokens, and then you do lose the life and draw the cards, but then all those tokens are going to be regenerated back, essentially, or essentially have regeneration, because of the Magecraft trigger about being able to get all those tokens back. Seriously, Plumb the Forbidden is a silly card. So yeah. And even if you just play this like in a blue-black control deck, and then you just play that Mentor card we were talking about earlier, where you do a second copy if you control a Warlock. Hey, this is a Warlock, coincidentally. Then just having a Magecraft trigger of then essentially getting 2 tokens out of it, that's really nice. Overall, this is a really good card. Like, this is an A- card. It's probably going to see some play in the right decks that want to play it. I'm very optimistic about that card. I am very optimistic. Next up, Spectre of the Fens. 3 and a black for a 2/3 with flying, so 4 mana, 2/3 flyer. That's decent for limited. And it has an activated ability of 6 mana. Target opponent loses 2 life, and you gain 2 life. Be very, very cautious of this card in limited. Because this is a 2/3 flyer, which is decent and limited, and it has the mana sink ability to essentially drain, and drain, and then drain, and then... We've seen these effects before on limited cards, and they are usually pretty good in limited. In standard, we have just better 4-drops. Like, the mana sink ability is nice, especially if you have lifelink shenanigans, but like I said, there's just better 4-drops in the format, so this is like on average a C-, but it's probably a C+ to even maybe a B- if you're playing this in limited. Never underestimate mana sink abilities of being able to drain your opponent. Next up, the Tenured Inkcaster. 4 and a black for a 2/2, so this better be doing something good. When it enters the battlefield, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature, so it can become a free. Okay. And then whenever a creature you control with a +1/+1 counter on it attacks, okay, each opponent loses 1 life and you gain 3 life. Oh. Yeah, this card is pretty nutty. Okay, the factor is that if you're playing this in the deck that you want to play this in, which is the deck that's the counters decks, which are going to constantly try to find a way to put counters on their creatures, this is kind of like the snake for Death Touch Tribal, where essentially you attack in with the Death Touch creatures, you still get the drain effect. You get the drain effect from this for every creature with a +1/+1 counter on it. You don't mind being aggressive with those creatures and such. And even then, if you already have a creature that's ready to attack and it just needs a counter to get the drain effect, you can use Tannered Inkcaster to essentially put that counter on it. If there's only one thing that's probably going to keep it from seeing constructed play, it's probably the factor that it's 5 mana. Even 5 mana for this effect is a bit costly, not going to lie. But we have seen cards like this type of effect at this high cost. Something to at least keep in mind. So, I'll be optimistic and give this a C. This is going to be a pretty decent limited card if you're in the deck that has a lot of counter synergies. And in Constructed, if you're playing a counters deck, you might try this at least once or twice to try to essentially win a game. Okay, next up, the Umbral Juke. Boop. You choose one. Target player sacrifices a creature or planeswalker, or create a 2/1 white and black Inkling creature token with flying. Pretty decent. It's always nice to have these spells that are essentially edicts at instant speed. The catch-22 is your opponent does choose this edict. This isn't like a soul share where they have to sacrifice their highest cost permanent. This is one where they can choose what they can sack, so if they have a go-wide board, this card gets less effective. But the fact that you do have the module ability of then just be able to create a flyer at instant speed, that's actually pretty nice. So, optimistically, for limited, it's going to be pretty good. In Constructed, it's going to be at least decent in the sideboard, maybe in some main board in some decks. So, I guess you can use this to sacrifice your own stuff if you have sacrifice synergies. So there's that versatility. That being said, I'm still going to give this like on average, a C-, because it's good, but it's not like great, especially with the removal that we have in the format. Next up, the Unwilling Ingredient. 1 mana for 1 black, 1/1 Menace Frog. Okay, so 1 mana, 1/1 Menace. That's pretty cool. Oh, and it has the ability of 2 and a black to exile this creature card from your graveyard. If you do, you draw a card and you lose 1 life. In Limited, this is going to be pretty good. A 1 mana, 1/1 Menace is not like amazing, but it's pretty decent. So you can pretty much get a few hits in, and then your creature will die inevitably if you use it as a chump blocker and such. So then later down the line, you have the mana sink ability of just essentially to lose a life and draw a card. That's really good. In Limited, this is going to see some play. In Constructed, probably not, but it's not a bad card. It's like a card that I think it's mostly, if it's going to see play, it's mostly going to be in Pauper. Because a 1/1 Menace is pretty decent in Pauper, and having the mana sink ability is pretty decent as well, so something to keep an eye out for Pauper. But for like a Standard or like any like Historic, there's just better 1-drops in the format. But it's a decent card. It's a decent enough that I'm going to give it a C. Next up, the NDFC. Actually, let's do the forward for this one. There we go. We have 2 sides, and this is the Gagari kind of like Dean cycle, which is Valentine, Dean of the Vein, as well as Lisette, Dean of the Root. So, Valentine, Dean of the Vein. It is a 1/1 for 1 black Vampire Warlock with Menace and Lifelink. As I mentioned before, 1 mana, 1/1 Menaces are good. Lifelink is really good. Then has, if a non-token creature an opponent controls would die, exile it instead. So, that's really good. And then, when you do, you may pay 2 mana if you have the mana sink. And if you do, create a pest creature token. Okay, this is just a really good hate bear. It's like even a hate 1-drop. Like, if your opponent is essentially has any graveyard shenanigans, or you don't want them to return their creature cards from the graveyard, you can just play Valentine as soon as turn 1. Now keep in mind, the creature has to die. It's not like a scenario where, like a Rest in Peace scenario, where anytime a card goes into the graveyard, it automatically gets exiled. It has to be a death trigger for the exile trigger to happen. That being said, you can play this as simple as 2-1, and then turn 2 Heartless Act anything, and then just be able to exile it automatically. That's very, very powerful. And then later down in the game, you can still play this, and essentially, anytime you activate this effect, get the mana sink to make a token. That's really good. That's a very powerful effect on the 1-drop. And then the best part, you still get Lisette, Deed of the Root, a 4-mana legendary creature human druid, which has... It's a 4/4, and it has, whenever you gain life, you may pay 1 mana. If you do, put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control. And those creatures gain trample until end of turn. Oh man, this... both sides are really good. Like, Lisette is a really good backside of the card, essentially. Because we have a lot of ways to gain life for very, very cheap in the format. We even have ways to gain life without having to spend mana. So, if we can do that on, like, a decent board state, and then just activate the ability here, we can put counters on everything and give them trample. That's a very good way to finish off a game. So, that's a very good... Like, you can do this for a variety of ways. You can sacrifice a pest token. You can cast any cheap life gain spell. Like, anytime you gain life, automatically boost up your team's power and toughness and give them trample temporary to swing in. That is really absurd. I think this is going to be a great constructed card. This is also going to be a very, very great, like, limited card. And I think it's also going to see play in Commander, either as a Commander or definitely in the 99 in some Gagari, or even, like, Sultai lists. So, overall, I'm going to give this, like, an A-. This card is very, very, very good. Like, there are better cards, yes, but this one is pretty much really close on the top.